Dissatisfaction, it's an innate part of our psychology. There's no amount of money or success or love that you're ever gonna achieve where you're like, cool, I'm done, I got it. I always felt self-help had gotten to, just be positive. There needed to be a correction, a little bit more pessimism. And so the book is all about how we need to be very careful of what we hope for. This blind faith in our hopes that actually causes all these problems in the first place.
But research shows that more than half of the population who have mental health needs are not actually receiving the treatment they need.
So I think there's something about this moment in the world where people are overly anxious, overly upset, and they understand that they're more anxious and upset than they should be about things. Even though we are smarter, safer, healthier, better off in most ways than we were 20, 30 years ago, emotionally, we are desperately clawing for a sense of meaning or a sense of hope. Everything I just described is why Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck was written. Like, I understood, what are you giving a fuck about? And should you be giving a fuck about it? You need struggle, you need challenge. So you might as well find something meaningful to struggle for. Besides, there's no such thing as a life without struggle or challenge. So get used to it. Let's just find the problems that we enjoy having.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mark Manson's first book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, is now sold over 9 million copies. This is pretty incredible for a guy that was in the dating industry and then a blogger before this happened. And he's got a new book out called Everything is Fucked. And what I think people resonate with Mark's ideas are a few simple concepts. The first is stop giving a fuck. Too many of us compare ourselves with all the people out there on Instagram, and trust me, you can always find someone that's richer than you, that's better looking than you, that has a better family than you. Stick to your values and try to work on those. The other thing that Mark really hit me to was the idea that as humans, we're always gonna have problems. So look for the best quality problems. It's not like one day you're gonna finish all of this hard work and it's gonna be easy. You're always gonna have problems, so get high quality problems in your life. I really love sitting down with Mark. He's got philosophies that can absolutely change your life. So sit back and enjoy this amazing episode. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mark Manson, the American self-help author, personal development consultant, entrepreneur, and blogger. Your work has been featured by major publications and broadcasters, including Time, CNN, and BBC News, and your blog articles are read by millions of people each month. Your first book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, is a New York Times bestseller with over 6 million copies sold. And your new book, Everything is Fucked, is a counterintuitive guide to the problems of hope. Mark, welcome to London Real.
It's good to be here.
Good to have you here. First of all, how is this city treating you? What do you think of this city? How does it feel compared to, say, New York, where you live?
This is the first time I've been to London, and it's sunny and beautiful outside. So I think that by itself is pretty welcome. But I like London. It's really not I like walking around London. You feel the history.
Yeah. It's kind of steeped in it, right?
Yeah.
And you just came from Australia, right? And you've been
Yes.
kind of touring the world.
Been doing a world tour.
Wow. Okay. Let's talk about how your life's changed in the last few years. Because, before Subtle Arts, which is orange, by the way, just in case people don't know, you hadn't written a book, right? Yeah. What's it like to go from that to this book? New York Times bestseller for, years, right? 6 million copies. I mean, most authors are probably super envious of you. You become famous. You're writing books with Will Smith.
Yep.
What's that like as far as a life adjustment?
I don't know. I mean, in totality, like when we sit here right now and look back on it, it feels very surreal and it feels sudden, but it's weird because when you're going through it, even though it happened quickly over the course of 3 years, like it still felt gradual, Like for instance, with Subtle Art, when it started taking off, a few months after it came out, I kept telling I get emails or calls from my publisher, my editor, saying like, "Oh, we sold this this many copies this week," or "Oh, we're about to hit 1 million." And in my head, I keep telling myself, I'm like, "Okay, well, yeah, it's temporary. I'm having a good run at it, but it's gonna drop off." And now we're 3.5 years into it or something. I think it was #1 last week. Still.
Wow.
So it's, to me, it's just the entire time I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, well, don't get too invested in it. Don't get too attached to it because it's likely it's not going to last, but it just keeps lasting. So it's actually been a very strange experience for me. And it was the same thing with the Will Smith thing, so he came, his team reached out and I had some conversations with my agent. And she was very honest. She, as an agent should be, she was like, "Look, most celebrity books don't happen. Most of them, it's a lot of talking, so like don't get too excited." And so I really went into it without expectations, kind of like, all right, well, it'd be cool to hang out with Will Smith, but we'll see what happens. And we're writing it, like it's actually happening, So it's, I think from the outside, it looks like this like huge, it's like Mark jumped on a roller coaster, look at him go, but from the inside, it's this very strange kind of uncertain experience of not knowing if what you're experiencing is actually real,
right,
or is going to last.
Okay. And because of your Buddhist background and everything in the book, you're kind of pre-trained to handle something like this.
Well, my mind kind of automatically goes that way anyway. Like I think some people have the opposite reaction. It's their book takes off and they're like, well, it's about damn time the world knows how brilliant I am, And right. I think that gets people in a lot of trouble because at some point you're not going to be on top. I've always had the opposite reaction of like, I don't know if this is such a great thing. I don't know if this is going to last. Enjoy it for the moment, but don't get too wrapped up in it. I'd rather be too humble than too full of myself.
Yeah.
And so I try to err on excess humility.
What's been the coolest thing that's happened on the back of this book? I mean, I know you met Will Smith hanging out with Pele, but what's been that one like single moment where you're like, wow, this is kind of crazy?
Yeah. I think, so there are a lot of exciting moments like that, like meeting Pele, but honestly, like the best moments are the stories that I get from people. So I did an event in Australia a few days ago, and it was funny because I did like a little meet and greet before the event, and this young woman, about 20 years old, she comes in with her parents, and she starts talking to me. She's like, "Oh, I'm a big fan, whatever." And the mom starts talking to me, and she's like, "Yeah, she made me read your book and blah, blah, blah." And meanwhile, like the father, he's probably mid-60s, like big, like man's man, he's like old school Australian dude. And he's just bawling, like he's just crying.
Wow.
And then the mom said, "Oh, he's already emotional." And she said he's a cancer survivor. And when he was going through chemo, he read your book over and over again, and he's just like sobbing in front of me. So it's moments like that to answer your question. It's moments like that that feels so much more powerful. Like, look, I'm proud of the New York Times list, and I'm proud of millions of copies or whatever, and it's great having money. But it's moments like that I'm like, oh shit, I really did something.
Yeah. Why do you think it pops so much, the book?
It's a good question. I think it's a confluence of a lot of things. You know, I would love to take credit for all of it, but I think it's, you know, the joke I make is like, I'll take credit for the first million, but you know, everything past that, it's like, I have no idea what's happening. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think part of it is I did nail the message and I nailed the tone and the style. Like, I think it really, for the self-help genre, I think it really is it's a unique and a new style that people were very hungry for. On top of that, I think just the timing. You know, one thing I noticed was when there's been a lot of political problems. I know here in the UK, there's with Brexit and everything. In the US, you have Trump. Australia's had a lot of problems. I started noticing in a lot of these countries, when the political problems would kind of flare up, sales would go up. So I think there's something about this moment in the world where people are, you know, in the airport, they're like, wow, I really wish I didn't give so much of a fuck. I really wish I cared less. So it's great title, great marketing. The book's really good, but it's also the kind of the zeitgeist that we're in right now. Of people are overly anxious, overly upset, and they understand that they're more anxious and upset than they should be about things.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a lot of like tribalism and divisiveness and people kind of angry, and then there's social media, which heightens it, and then people feel disconnected from social media, and maybe people can't put their finger on it, but they know that they need something to stop feeling that way.
Yeah.
And then I guess your book comes up, and it seems like it's a good solution, and the title kind of implies that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's that title in particular, the subtle art, it seems to play very well, like on Instagram, for instance. Like, I think I managed to make self-help cool. You know, most people who buy self-help books, you're not like showing them to all you're not like, oh, hey, check it out, I got relationship problems. You know, like it's there's a little bit of shame.
It's an industry that's mocked easily.
Yes.
Even though it helps a lot of people, but a lot of people point the finger. We're real good at that in Britain as well.
Yes.
So, but your book has a way of kind of mocking yourself while you're doing it, or?
Yeah, I think there's an edginess to it.
Right.
You know, where people are like, yeah, I'm gonna stop giving a fuck. You know, and then they like snap a picture with themselves with, like, they're excited to snap a picture with it.
Right.
And that's, you know, my goal. Even going back to my blogging days, you know, my goal was always, I always felt self-help had gotten a little bit too airy-fairy, you know, just be positive, just follow your dream. You know, like everything was, I think there needed to be a correction. There needed to be a little bit more pessimism and cynicism in the self-help world. And so I very much saw my role as like, I want to bring that. And I think I just underestimated how much of a demand for that there was.
Right. Even though it's not necessarily a pessimistic or cynical book. It's actually, but it kind of calls people on their BS and says, this is what you have to do. It's going to take hard work.
Yeah.
But let's be honest about what it is. And,
yes.
And it's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, I've started calling it pessimistic self-help, but pessimism more in like a philosophical sense, and that like I genuinely think like humans, like we suck. Like humans, like we kind of suck at things. You know, like we're not very rational. We're not objective at all. We're very selfish and prejudiced, and you know all these things that psychology has been showing us for decades. And so I was kind of living in that psych research, doing my blog, and then meanwhile I'm like looking at the self-help industry, and it's like, oh yeah, if you just believe in yourself, you know, everything's gonna go great. It's like, well, no, you're gonna be a narcissist. You know, if you just believe everything you think, like that's narcissism. So I see it as like, let's start at as you said, being honest about our flawed nature. Our brains are not optimized. We didn't evolve for truth or happiness. We evolved for survival. And so a lot of the mechanisms in our psychology that helped us survive make us unhappy and make us irrational or unobjective. And so that should be the starting point for any self-improvement.
Yeah. So simple, but very powerful way to start.
Yeah.
You once said your mission is to help people create better problems.
Yes.
Which just sounds kind of cool when you first hear it. You know, you've also said problems never stop. They get exchanged or upgraded. And then the real problem that you're ever going to have is the lack of problems.
Yes.
That's a pretty interesting statement that most people, maybe if they think about it, makes sense, but people would have a hard time coming up with that on their own. Mm-hmm. How do you come up with that? And then is that a Buddhist thing, and is that something you were always interested in?
There's definitely Buddhist influence in my work. You know, I was very into the Buddhist stuff in my early 20s, and it was very powerful for me. I think I've kind of drifted away from it a little, so the influence is there, but I'm not beholden to it.
Why were you drawn to Buddhism?
I think that's a really good question. It just, this is going to sound so cliche, it just made sense. Like
it's the opposite of Americanism to a certain extent.
It really is. I had a number of, so I grew up, we were talking about this before the interview started. I grew up in Texas. And I mean, technically I grew up in Austin, Texas, but this was the 80s and this was, and it was outside of Austin. So it was Texas. It was like horses and cowboys and Jesus and like the whole shebang.
Yeah, what is Texas for people that don't know? What is it though? How do you explain it to the world? What is Texas in the 80s? It's big hats and conservatism and and tough guys and what else? Religion and
I mean it's big trucks and you know, the way I describe it is, if you've seen the movie or the TV show Friday Night Lights, like that's actually based on where I grew up. You know, it's like the high school football game Friday night is the center of the community's existence. And I was just this intellectual, kind of contrarian kid who I never, from a very early age, didn't feel like I fit in. You know, it's like, where I grew up, you were punished for being too smart. You know, it was the old like, oh, you think you're smart using big words, you know, and they'd like kind of push you around for it, you know? So I went to church. I had to go to church all the time, but I didn't really believe in religion. So I had a very kind of like just angry, frustrated adolescence. And so I used a lot of drugs. And
any particular kind?
Well, I mean, kind of most of them, but I had a few powerful psychedelic experiences. Okay. And I think most people who have done psychedelics or know about psychedelics like understand that sometimes you kind of tap into these, like this broader consciousness. And so that happened, and I was like, oh shit, there's something more, you know, here. There's something more to life or the universe or whatever. And so I became very interested in religion. I started reading about other religions and studying other religions. And then I came across Buddhism, and it just made sense. You know, there's no big deity who's judging you. You know, it's life is, you're attached to everything, and that attachment removes you from the reality of that everything is one. And
there is no good and bad. They're just what is, right?
Yes.
I read Siddhartha when I was a kid. And so that was like, blew me away. And I still had a hard time getting my head around it because I'm this punk kid living the American dream. It's the opposite of what I was seeing on TV.
Yes.
So I remember being so confused.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was, again, the first seed I had of what that was.
Absolutely. And so then I started meditating, just kind of dabbling. And I noticed that meditation was the only thing that kind of made me feel like kind of that transcendent experience on the psychedelics. Like if I meditated for a long time, I would start to feel like a little bit of that. Okay. And so I was like, oh, well, that's what I've been looking for, you know? So I spent a few years really into it.
Interesting.
And reading a lot. And we were talking about Cambridge earlier in Boston. So I was a member at the Cambridge Zen Center, and I would go on Zen, like retreats, doing Zen meditation and reading a bunch of books. So
it's before meditation was popular.
Yeah, this was 2004.
Okay.
So it was like if you were kind of into hippy dippy alternative lifestyles. You know, it was, people knew about it and talked about it, but it wasn't like today where it's,
because there was no YouTube and no apps and
there's no Headspace.
Yeah,
and
right. So you had to really seek it out and be in the know.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, so that planted the seeds of a lot of these ideas. Even your upbringing in Texas had a lot to do with these books.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the things that surprised me about the new book when I was writing it is that there were a few times where I was writing something and I was like, whoa, that's a Jesus thing. You know, like there's a chapter in there where I talk about kind of unconditional forgiveness and love. And I'm like sitting there writing it, I'm like, this is totally a Jesus thing. And I'm like, man, I haven't thought about Jesus in like 20 years, you know? And but it was interesting because writing this new book, one of the unexpected, we can talk about this later, but one of the unexpected side effects is that it kind of, it gave me a little bit of respect for the Christianity I grew up with that maybe I hadn't been giving it before when I was younger because I was angry. But yeah, the Buddhist stuff, that's kind of, the Buddhist thing kind of kicked off my interest in philosophy, my interest in psychology, trying to understand people, you know, relationships, interactions. A lot of that started around that same time of like, because I think what happened to me was I had this set of experiences where I'm like, wow, my brain does not work the way I thought it worked. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on up here that I was not aware of, and I want to understand that. And so, you know, I started reading like Carl Jung and Freud and took some philosophy courses at school, and it like that's kind of where everything began. Or at least I started to get kind of serious about it.
Okay.
For myself, yeah.
Okay. Well, like a lot of these messages have come up on the show, you know, before, and I'd love to like talk about them. But first, like for people that have never heard of your stuff before, you know, if you want to help people create better problems, they're going to say, "Well, I don't want this guy around." What do you mean by that?
So, my argument in all of my work is that dissatisfaction it's an innate part of our psychology. Like there's no amount of money or success or love that you're ever going to achieve where you're like, cool, I'm done. I got it. You know, every experience that you produce in your life or that you achieve in your life, your mind will find flaws. There will be unexpected or unintended consequences of that success or that love or whatever. And so basically the problems never go away. Problems are an inherent part of our existence.
And yet we walk around in this world of one day I'm going to retire and then there's no problems.
Yes.
I'm going to get married and then I won't have relationship problems. When I get rich, I won't, you know. And yet we have this narrative in our heads and in the media and in the culture that it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's a trick that it's like a magic trick that our brain keeps doing on us, and we never figure it out. You know, it's like
crazy?
it's like well, if I just get that promotion, like everything's gonna be fine, right? And your brain's like, yeah, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. Like keep working.
Yeah.
Then you get the promotion, and within like 2 days, you're like, okay, well, I need another promotion now, you know, and it just keeps going. And so, since every form of success is gonna produce its own problems, the point that I make is that what we should actually shoot for is let's just find the problems that we enjoy having, you know? So, because that ends up actually being what feels meaningful in our life, because we actually need problems. It's the fact that I have problems in my life and I work on them and I improve upon them. That is actually what gives my life a sense of meaning. You know, if everything was just great and I'm just like kicking it with pina coladas at the beach, you know, like that's not meaningful. That doesn't feel, it gets old. It feels very shallow and superficial.
Yeah, so we see that with rich housewives, people that retire, people that have made it, then their problem is no problems.
Right.
So,
and then their mind has to sets to work creating problems. So that's why you get, you know, rich housewives who, you know, just gossip about each other all day, or, you know, old retired people who lose their minds because they didn't get a discount at their favorite restaurant. You know, it's like that. It doesn't matter where you are in life, like your mind will generate a certain amount of problems, like perceived problems in your existence.
Yeah.
And so the thing that makes, say, getting upset, if the biggest problem in your life is that, you don't get a discount at your favorite restaurant, like that's a bad problem. That's not a meaningful problem. There's no benefit to having that problem. It makes you more, that's a problem that makes you more kind of stuck within yourself. So a good problem is a problem that feels meaningful, that helps yourself and helps others, connects you with other people, and that actually like serves a higher purpose. So the point I make in subtle art is like the reason, like people with money have money problems. People without money have money problems. It's just that you would rather have the money problems of having money than not having money. So it's a better problem. That's why you want to make money. It's because you'd rather have the problem of like, what do I invest in than like, how am I going to eat? Like that's, so it's, the problems don't go away. You just improve upon the problems. You just find better problems. You trade in your low level problems for higher level problems.
I think in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he said problems are like gas in a gas chamber. He's like, whatever they are, they fill up the room.
Yes.
So, and that's, so I thought of that when I was reading your book. So I was just like, okay, this is interesting. So everyone needs to accept you're always going to have problems.
Yes.
Even when you don't have any, you're going to go find them. And then you're going to magnify them to overcome your headspace. Like you said, whether you're arguing about a discount, or that same grandparent could be thinking, I have to raise this grandkid and they are such a big pain, but I've got to spend my life trying to make them a real great human.
Yeah.
And both of them could stress them out, but one they would probably agree is a better problem to have.
Sure, because it's as simple as you could just ask these people. It's like, if you ask that person, are you proud of being upset that you didn't get the discount at the restaurant? They'd say no. It's like, oh yeah, it's kind of a silly thing to get upset about or whatever. Whereas if you ask somebody like, are you proud of raising your grandson? Everybody's gonna say yes. Right. So it's like, it's that hindsight, because emotions only exist in the present. It's when you look back into the past, the only thing that you recognize is the meaning. So it's like we all have past experiences that we look back on that we can see that we got very emotionally worked up about something that was not meaningful. And we tend to feel like that was really stupid. We shouldn't have gotten worked up about it. Whereas there are other things that it's like, yes, I got emotionally worked up, but it was a very meaningful experience. It was a very important problem. And I'm glad I got upset about it. I'm glad I worked on it. I'm glad I struggled. I'm glad I wasn't happy. And so that's what we want to go for. Because if the state of our nature is that we are just always going to experience problems, then the question then becomes, how do we find meaningful problems?
Right. I did a planning session with my wife the other day, right here in the office, where she came in on a Sunday. And we just did this once. It's not like I'm a genius on this, but I wrote down on the whiteboard 2020, 2030, 2040, 20, all the way up to 2070, 2080. Yeah. And then I said, here, honey, we're dead. And I was trying to plan our future, and she started crying, and I was like, oh my gosh. But we were trying to plan like when the kids are going to be this and what we're going to do. But just listening to you, I thought, should we be planning the problems that we want to have in the future? So here, the kids will be out, so now we're going to have to find new problems or new challenges. Is that the way we should kind of think about our future? Finding out the problems that we want to have? Because that way you kind of come to the terms that you're always going to have them, as opposed to, we'll have the house then, and then everything's going to be great then.
Yeah. I think it's a better heuristic. I don't know. The same way it's, like, I love doing those exercises too, but you learn that it's like, okay, you write stuff out for 10 years, 20 years, but you know that it's like, most of it you're not going to end up, you're going to change it as the years go on. But kind of the point is that it just gives you direction. I think the same thing is true of like choosing your problem. So I think it's, what you mentioned is a great example. So at some point your kids are going to grow up and move out. That's going to be a problem. And so...
Because you won't have a problem.
You won't have a problem. So you can have all this empty time, all this extra time without meaningful problems to solve or meaningful things to kind of engage you. And so I think it's important ahead of time to think about, okay, what can I find that will feel meaningful to kind of fill that void? I've got a friend who's a sports psychologist, and he said that one of the most important conversations he has with athletes. He said, even when they're like 24, 25, is he says, like, you need a retirement plan, because it's you're one injury away. This thing that you've been doing since you were 3 years old, that you've been known for your entire life, that is making you millions of dollars, within the next 10 years, most likely, it's going to be taken away from you. And so you are an identity existential crisis waiting to happen. And so you need to start thinking now of, like, who are you going to be when you don't have baseball or don't have football? Right. What are you going to do with your time? What's going to get you up in the morning? You know, and it's sometimes it's called negative visualization, of like imagining future calamities so that you're better prepared for them emotionally when they do happen, or if they happen.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. 200 years ago, we were living in a world of scarcity, and now we're living in a world of abundance. Mm-hmm. How does that affect the way we have to live today? I mean, now we've got too much food, too much media, like too much everything. And now, so what does that mean?
I think we live in a very interesting time, and I think a lot of what we're experiencing as political polarization, a lot of public frustration at social media and tech companies and corruption and all this stuff. I think a lot of that is at its root that for most of human history, it was all about more. You know, if you learned more than the next guy, you would have an advantage. If you were able to do more or have more opportunities, that's what got you ahead. I think today that's reversed. I think today what gets you ahead is knowing how to focus on less. Knowing how to cut through the bullshit, knowing how to ignore, like, okay, those opinions aren't valid or aren't helpful. That's probably not true. These are the two things I should focus on. Like, it's very few people have that skill right now. And I feel like that's the skill that's going to get you ahead right now. Because one of the things I've been talking about on my tour is, I think there's a lot to be said that I think the human mind has a bandwidth limit. There's only a certain amount of information we can process. And once you exceed that bandwidth limit, our minds start taking shortcuts. And those shortcuts basically look like prejudice, stereotypes, bigotry, irrational beliefs, narcissism. And so if you're consuming too much stuff and it's not nutritious information, your brain's going to start taking all these shortcuts, and it's going to make you worse off. And so I think the real challenge today is about finding those, find the 20% that produces the 80 result, or the 20% that, represents 80% of what's actually going on.
And that's the subtle art of not giving a fuck about most things and choosing the things to give a fuck about.
Yes. Find the handful, find the handful of people that truly matter and really cultivate those relationships. Find the handful of causes or issues that really matter and focus all your energy on them, and find the few amounts of information sources or media that is really, really helpful and beneficial for both you and the world, and then just cut out all the bullshit.
And find the few values that are important to you and the few metrics that are important to you, and focus on those, and don't focus on the hundreds out there. That you can always find someone on Instagram that's better at you than all of those. And that's hard.
I think one of the jokes I make in Subtle Art is I said, like, I don't care how good you are at something, there's an 11-year-old on YouTube who's better. Like, that's just the world we live in, So it's hard to really take pride. And I mean, this kind of gets into what I talk about in the second book, which is like, back in the day, we kind of lived in these smaller communities. We didn't have a lot of communication with, we didn't know what people in New York and London were doing. It's like we had our little neighborhood and our little city. And so if you were like the guitar player in your town, like, that was your identity. That's where you got meaning. That's how you were validated, what a lot of your relationships were based on. And I think being exposed to everything, and now you go online and there's some 8-year-old who's better than you, it kind of robs us of those identities and those sources of meaning for ourselves. And it's the unseen negative side effect of being globally aware.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's weird, because in one way, YouTube and Instagram, like, for example, I know I have a lot of people come on here that are into physical movement, and the fact I have a hand balancing teacher who does one-arm handstands. I mean, the fact is now you can see so many people doing these physical movements that 10 years, 20 years ago you thought were nearly impossible.
Yeah.
And by seeing that they're possible, everyone does them all.
Yeah.
So like the learning curve is just climbing of just human possibilities of movement. And that's one of the great things of globalization, maybe because learning's happening fast and people are super inspired by people pushing the envelope. But then the downside is that now you're constantly comparing yourself with all of these people.
Yes.
And the bandwidth, the Dunbar number, like none of that stuff is what we're used to.
Well, it's a multifaceted paradox, because as you pointed out, the technology has large informational and material advantages, but there are emotional disadvantages, and that's kind of what the new book is about, is that there's something about, even though we are smarter, safer, healthier, better off in most ways than we were 20, 30 years ago, emotionally we are desperately clawing for a sense of meaning or a sense of hope. Mental illnesses are rising in most developed places in the world. Pessimism is at all-time highs. Polarization issues. People like loneliness is a huge issue. So there's a weird asymmetry that comes with a lot of this technology. Like the same way we benefit from learning all this amazing stuff on YouTube, there's a certain, it destroys our sense of community. It removes, it makes it more difficult to kind of satiate ourselves emotionally than, it used to be. It's like if you wanted to go learn something, like you went, sat in a room with 20 people and took a class, and like that built a sense of community, sense of purpose. You developed relationships. Everything feels very meaningful. It's like you can learn all this great, you can go online and learn all this great stuff, and be smarter than you ever would have been otherwise, but you're isolated.
Yeah.
And there's millions of other people doing it too, so it doesn't feel meaningful. There's nothing validating you in particular for it. And so it all starts to feel a little bit pointless at a certain point.
And you think that is the root of a lot of this division and tribalism? Do you think it's just as these human animal and maybe as a global species that when this stuff starts happening up here that it has deep-seated like problems and we start lashing out, like you said, paradox of choice, where too many decision fatigue, and then you start becoming, like you said, bigoted or racist or these kinds of things.
Because that literally is your mind trying to take a shortcut.
Right.
It's like when everything you do, you have hundreds of options. It's just overwhelming and it's fatiguing, And so at some point you have to start developing principles or heuristics to kind of narrow down your selections of like what you're going to pursue or spend your time on or pay attention to. And so, when people fall into prejudice and bigotry, like that is what their mind is doing, is they're like, well, you know what? We've got 100 options, but this is way too hard. So let's just decide that these 60 are bad, no matter what, because then at least that makes the load becomes easier on our minds. I personally think, having spent the last few years researching this, I really think social isolation and loneliness is kind of the root cause of a lot of what we're experiencing as like a post-truth world or political polarization or just people being upset. Like I think the fact that it's so much harder to get out of the house, have meaningful face-to-face relationships, and even have those face-to-face relationships where both people are present. They're not on their phones. They're not like texting or whatever. Have that kind of awkward, uncomfortable interaction that ultimately generates that sense of meaning and identity and purpose. I think the lack of that, the way that we emotionally compensate for it, is going online and just being idiots.
and hating on people. I think you're right. I think you're right, man. And it probably is going to get worse before it gets better, because what you talk about in the second book especially is taking personal responsibility and going in and, taking ownership of all these things. And that's a hard thing to learn how to do. And I feel like it's going to take time.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm pessimistic in the short term. I'm optimistic in the long term.
Okay.
I agree. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think, the big argument in the second book about hope is that ultimately it's we all need some hope. We need hope to kind of function well psychologically. And the more we struggle with meaning or purpose in our lives, the more hope we look for to kind of compensate for that. But the point I make in the book is that when you're putting all of the meaning in your life into your hopes, when you, like, let's say everything you live for is the hope that, some policy will pass in your country, or that you'll get your dream job or whatever. What you do is you make yourself very vulnerable to just like an existential crisis, because when things don't go your way, when life hands your ass to you, when something unexpected pops up, if all of your hopes are in that one basket and that basket gets yanked away, like you're lost. You're just completely lost. And so the book is all about how we need to be very careful of what we hope for, because it's kind of this blind faith in our hopes, and just constantly doubling down on our hopes that actually causes all these problems in the first place. We need to hold our hopes lightly, be skeptical of them.
Yeah. I had Jordan Peterson in here, and he says we shouldn't pursue happiness, we should pursue meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what you talk about.
Yeah, it's funny. I agree. So like the psychology side of what he talks about, like I totally on the same page, and I think a lot of his we're both experiencing a lot of popularity because I think we're two of the only people in this space that are talking about that it's like, no, you need struggle, you need challenge. And besides, there's no such thing as a life without struggle or challenge. So like, get used to it. So you might as well find something meaningful to struggle for. Like that is your job. That's the ultimate responsibility of like being kind of a grown, functioning human.
I had an AI guy in here last week, Dr. Ben Gertzel, runs a company called SingularityNet, really smart guy. And he's like, well, Brian, we're gonna upload our consciousness to the cloud, and then we're not gonna have any problems. Okay, I've been hanging out with Jordan Peterson and reading your books, and I'm like, but we need struggle to have identity as humans. And he's like, what are you talking about, Brian? No, we don't. Like, you're just gonna be up there in some cloud dream, being a superhero, wherever you want to be, and that'll be the next evolution of human consciousness. We don't have to worry about problems. And part of me just thought, that's crazy. But then part of me thought, maybe I should listen to what he says. Maybe this is the ultimate evolution of human beings, but I always think that we will have problems.
Well, he should read the last chapter of the new book, because I talk about AI. And basically what I say is that if we do end up with a cloud consciousness, there will be tribal civil wars programmed into the cloud so that we all feel that we have something meaningful to fight for as we're in the cloud, like I don't know, maybe he probably knows way better than I do, but like the argument that I make is that it's, again, this is a fundamental function of our psychology, like that we evolved this for a very specific, we evolved to have tribal fights and like hopes for some kind of utopian future. Like this is what got us here. The problem is that now our technology has advanced to such a point that I make the argument that, we're not mature enough to kind of deal with it. It's like handing a bazooka to a 4-year-old. You just like really hope he doesn't press the trigger. Like that we're very quickly arriving at that point as a culture, as a species. And so my hope, and I use that word very deliberately, is my hope is that the technology, the AI advances far enough to kind of pull the gun away from the baby and be like, let me show you how to use this responsibly, or maybe just keep it away from us entirely.
Right. Otherwise, it could just escalate to these really big problems.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. You mentioned about having people are really lonely these days, and I get it, even though we're connected. And I think that's why, honestly, things like this, these long-form discussions where you get to have a real conversation. We were talking about Eddie Hall earlier.
Yeah.
The world's strongest man, and I had a 2-hour conversation with him where he really got emotional about like his mom and his grandma. She died on her deathbed, and he promised her that he would do this thing. And I think people spend 2 hours with him and they're like, wow, I feel like I spent time with a human and I'm connected again, as opposed to the Instagram feed or the Facebook thing and the memes and the where I don't feel connected. So it's weird in the fact that I think that's why long form is interesting to people, because they feel that human connection again. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I absolutely. I think about this a lot because it's, I've blogged for 11 years now. And I remember early in my career, so I've always written very long articles, 20, 30-page articles. And early in my career, people are always like, man, you got to write shorter articles, man. Like, people don't have the attention span. And I'm like, it's funny because the longer the articles get, the more successful they are. Like the more they get shared. And I think that is an effect of it, is again, it's kind of when you present people with long-form content, and again, this is assuming it's really good and engaging, but like when you present people with long-form content, you're helping them cut out all that noise and distraction that we were talking about earlier, where you're helping them only give a fuck about something that seems like very important, because it's like I could spend 3 hours on YouTube watching like 40 different videos, and some of them will be good, some will be bad, but the whole time I'm having to like make decisions and figure out, is this worth watching? Or like, no, I don't really like that, go back to this one, whatever. Or I could put on a video like this and just know, it's like, all right, next 2 hours, like I'm set. And it's like, there's something relieving about that. That people like.
Yeah, very much so. To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website, londonreal.tv, or click the link in the description below.